The papyrus, put it on my table every month. I don't wanna be sad. Don't even try to hide it. No, I don't wanna lose it. And you say how it is, it's so inviting. The papyrus, we're all so alive. The papyrus.
Welcome to Papyrus TV Africa. Global News. Trump announces total ceasefire between Israel and Iran, but no confirmation yet from warring states. Aviation routes squeezed by Middle East war zone as airlines grapple with rising costs, safety risks. Sole survivor of Air India crash carries brother's coffin in tearful funeral. Federal judge blocks Trump's ban on international students at Harvard. U.S. Supreme Court clears way for Trump's controversial third country deportation policy. Canada and European Union sign historic defense pact amid global turbulence, Trump uncertainty. Popular brewery loses control of facilities in eastern Congo as rebels take over key cities. Chad retaliates against U.S. visa ban with diplomatic sanctions. Kenya grapples with tragedy, public anger, and economic scrutiny. India announces strategic five-nation tour. In a dramatic and unexpected announcement on June 23rd, Monday night, U.S. President Donald Trump declared that Iran and Israel had agreed to a complete and total ceasefire following weeks of intense hostilities that are threatening to spiral into a region-wide catastrophe. Posting on Truth Social, Trump said the ceasefire would begin in approximately 6 hours and last 12 hours initially, after which the war will be considered ended. Trump described the development as a diplomatic breakthrough, averting a crisis that could have gone on for years and destroyed the entire Middle East, attributing its resolution to undisclosed negotiations. However, neither Iran nor Israel had confirmed or commented on the claim as at the time of this report. The announcement comes just 48 hours after U.S. forces launched retaliatory strikes on Iranian positions following missile attacks from Tehran targeting American bases. Those attacks, which briefly forced the closure of the Qatari airspace, underscored the volatility of the situation. The intensifying conflict in the Middle East has added yet another layer of complication to global aviation, with airlines scrambling to find safe, viable routes amid mounting no-fly zones. While former President Trump's ceasefire announcement offered a glimmer of hope, industry analysts warn that any disruption to air traffic in the Gulf, one of the world's busiest flight corridors, has a cascading effect worldwide. British Airways, Singapore Airlines, Air France-KLM, and Finnair were among carriers that grounded flights to cities like Doha and Dubai over the weekend. Finnair suspended operations to Doha until the month end. While some flights resumed briefly, Qatar closed its airspace again Monday night after Iran launched another missile salvo. Airspace over Iraq, Iran, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Egypt remains restricted or entirely closed. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, ESA, continues to advise against flying over large swaths of the region. The global air route grid is now being redrawn in real time, with many airlines forced to detour north through Georgia and Afghanistan or south via Saudi Arabia. The situation has placed enormous strain on carriers already struggling to maintain schedules in the face of high jet fuel prices and ongoing labor shortages. John Strickland, an aviation analyst, noted that longer routes are not only expensive due to fuel costs, but are pushing crew duty hours beyond regulatory limits, causing further cancellations. The geopolitical crunch has exposed vulnerabilities created by earlier disruptions, including the closure of Ukrainian airspace and bans on Western airlines using Russian routes, both of which have already rerouted a significant portion of global flights. As this news of no-go zones emerge, the pressure on global aviation corridors is reaching a boiling point. In a heart-wrenching scene in the coastal Indian town of Diu, 40-year-old Vishwash Kumar Ramesh, the sole survivor of last Thursday's catastrophic Air India crash, carried the coffin of his brother AJ and two other confirmed dead. Bandaged and visibly grieved, Ramesh shouldered the burden not just of family loss but of extraordinary survival. The Dreamliner crash, Air India Flight 171, has been called the worst air disaster involving a modern scheduled aircraft in years. The Boeing 787 plunged into a medical college hostel in Ahmedabad shortly after takeoff. All 241 people on board and 30 on the ground were killed. The only exception was Ramesh, who escaped through a hole near his seat and staggered into the hands of rescuers. Preliminary findings indicate that a critical emergency component known as the ram air turbine (RAT), which supplies emergency power, was deployed, suggesting a catastrophic failure of the plane's main engines. A distress call from the cockpit moments before the crash reported "Thrust not achieved. Falling. Mayday, mayday, mayday." The investigation is expected to take months or years, but already questions are mounting over the aircraft's airworthiness and Air India's maintenance practices. While the company insists the plane had no recent technical concerns, 66 Dreamliner flights have since been cancelled, with 13 aircraft grounded for extended checks. The tragedy casts a long shadow over the Tata Group's ambitious plan to revive Air India. It also reignites scrutiny over Boeing's 787 Dreamliner, which, despite its celebrated fuel efficiency, has failed and faced criticism for persistent quality control lapses. In a rebuke to President Trump's latest attempt to exact executive control over academic institutions, a federal judge in Boston on Monday, June 23rd, extended a legal injunction blocking his administration from banning international students from attending Harvard University. Judge Alison Burroughs' ruling bars enforcement of a June 4 presidential proclamation that alleged national security threats as justification for revoking Harvard's right to host foreign students. The proclamation, which also called on Senator Marco Rubio to review the visas of current Harvard students, had triggered outrage from academics and civil liberty groups. Harvard alleges that Trump's move was political retaliation for the university's refusal to comply with White House demands to restructure its governance and curriculum to align with administration ideology. Nearly 6,800 foreign students, about 27% of Harvard's student population, were potentially affected. Trump has accused the university of fostering anti-Semitism and colluding with the Chinese Communist Party, though no evidence has been publicly presented. Meanwhile, critics say the administration has overlooked rising Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate tied to Israel's war in Gaza. Harvard has filed two lawsuits seeking to unblock $2.5 billion in frozen federal funds and protect its right to enroll international students. The legal fight could become a landmark First Amendment case over academic freedom, and the administration shifts tactics from executive orders to administrative revocation proceedings. The U.S. Supreme Court has granted the Trump administration's emergency request to lift a lower court's block on the deportation of migrants to third countries without allowing them to present fear-based claims, a move critics say opens the door to human rights violation. The unsigned order overturns a previous ruling by George Brian Murphy of Boston, who had blocked the government from deporting migrants to nations like South Sudan without due process protections. Murphy had warned the practice likely violated constitutional guarantees, especially after discovering the government tried to quietly deport 8 men to South Sudan, a country the State Department deems unsafe due to armed conflict and lawlessness. The migrants temporarily held at a military base in Djibouti will now be subject to removal under the administration's policy, which claims compliance with due process and necessity for national security. The administration said the men had committed serious crimes in the U.S., including murder and armed robbery, and argued their home countries refused to take them back. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, writing in dissent and joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, called the ruling incomprehensible and a gross abuse of judicial power. Apparently, the court finds the idea that thousands will suffer violence in far-flung locales more palatable than the remote possibility that a district court exceeded its remedial powers, she wrote. White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson applauded the ruling, saying it reaffirms the president's authority to remove criminal illegal aliens and make America safe again. Department of Homeland Security official Tricia McLaughlin added, "Fire up deportation planes." In a landmark move signaling transatlantic realignment, Canada and the European Union signed a sweeping security and defense pact on Monday, June 23rd, broadening cooperation on military, cyber, and space defense, as well as joint arms procurement. The agreement comes amid mounting global instability and declining U.S. leadership under President Donald Trump. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney joined European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council leader Antonio Costa in Brussels to sign the pact. Carney described the agreement as a hinge moment of history, adding that Canada is the most European of the non-European countries. Notably absent from praise at the press conference was President Trump, whose frequent disparagement of NATO and threats of U.S. withdrawal have unnerved European allies. Carney, who won a decisive April election opposing calls for Canada to become the 51st U.S. state, pledged to diversify Canada's partnership. The new EU-Canada Pact opens the door for Canadian access to the bloc's €150 billion Safe Defense Fund, which will enable joint procurement efforts, especially in air defense. Von der Leyen emphasized that negotiation on Canada's access to joint progress will begin swiftly. The defense agreement marks the first of its kind between EU and any country in the Americas and signals a deeper pivot of traditional US allies towards a more integrated and self-reliant European defense framework in the face of growing authoritarian threats and US unpredictability. Dutch brewing giant Heineken announced Friday, June 20th, that it had lost operational control of its facilities in Bukavu and Goma, two strategic cities in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, now reportedly under the control of rebel forces. The company said its breweries had been raided and armed personnel had seized its site, forcing a full evacuation of staff. Operations in these regions were suspended earlier in March due to security threat, but the situation has since worsened. Heineken's local unit Bralima stated that the conditions required to operate responsibly and safely are no longer present. The Bukavu facilities alone had employed over 1,000 people both directly and indirectly, while Bralima continues to operate in safer parts of Congo. The disruption poses a major blow to local economies and regional distribution chains. The company reiterated that the safety of its staff was its top priority and said it would continue to financially support affected workers. The escalating conflict, fueled by tensions between government forces and multiple insurgent factions, has again raised alarms over the stability of the Great Lakes region and the risks to foreign business operations. In a rare diplomatic standoff, the government of Chad has suspended the issuance of visas to U.S. citizens in retaliation for Washington's recently expanded travel ban affecting 7 African countries. The move signals growing frustration on the African continent over what many see as discriminatory immigration policies imposed unilaterally by the United States. President Mahamat Idris Deby accused the U.S. of undermining years of regional cooperation and mutual investment, describing the ban as an affront to the dignity and sovereignty of African nations. The visa suspension will apply to all categories of American travelers except diplomats and UN officials. The U.S. State Department recently expanded its so-called high-risk travel list to include Chad, Mali, and the Central African Republic and others, citing concerns over security, terrorism, and governance. African leaders have blasted the list as one-sided, failing to acknowledge the U.S. role in regional instability. The African Union has convened an emergency session to discuss a coordinated continental response. Early indications suggest that several other nations, including Senegal and the Democratic Republic of Congo, may follow Chad's lead in enacting reciprocal visa restrictions. In another development, Kenya is facing a wave of social and institutional crisis, including a deadly transport accident, renewed public anger over police brutality, and international scrutiny over financial transparency. On June 9, a tragic road crash in Nyandara County claimed the lives of six student athletes returning from national championship. Investigations point to driver fatigue and inadequate safety checks as contributing factors. The tragedy has prompted the Ministry of Transport to initiate a nationwide review of school travel regulations. A week later, public protests erupted in Nairobi after police were accused of executing suspected criminals without trial. Video footage showed unarmed youth being shot, sparking outrage, with human rights groups calling for the resignation of key security officials. One protester was confirmed dead and dozens were injured in ensuing clashes. Amidst the turmoil, Kenya was added to the European Union's high risk jurisdiction list for money laundering. The government has disputed the designation, fearing it will hurt investor confidence and access to international credit markets. President William Ruto has vowed to implement reforms, but faces mounting pressure to restore public trust and demonstrate accountability across government sectors. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will embark on a five-nation tour in July targeting diplomatic and strategic engagement with countries across Africa, Latin America, and West Asia. The tour is part of a renewed foreign policy thrust aimed at deepening India's leadership role in the global south and reinforcing global counter-terrorism cooperation. The announcement follows a deadly terrorist attack in the northern town of Pahalgam earlier this month, which left 17 dead. The incident has catalyzed India's push for a coordinated multilateral response to transnational terror threats, especially among nations that share post colonial and non aligned legacies. The countries on Modi's itinerary have not been officially disclosed, but are expected to include strategic partners in Kenya, Brazil, UAE, Egypt, and Indonesia. India is expected to sign agreements on trade, defense cooperation, digital innovation, and joint anti terror intelligence platforms. Foreign policy analysts view the trip as part of India's efforts to position itself as a bridge between the West and the developing world amid rising global polarization. India is increasingly being seen as the voice of moderation and self reliance in an age of fractured alliances, said Professor Davika Raghavan of Jawaharlal Nehru University.